I am joined here today by three third cousins, Carla Johnson, Osborne Livingston, and Tracy Livingston, who I've met other members of their family, but they are connected to me through Timbuctoo because our great-great-great-grandfather, whose name was Lambert Giles, had two children, two of whom were our grandparents. And so one of the things that Timbuctoo has done for me is to connect me to other people that I didn't know before. But what I really wanted to do was talk about how I came to know about Timbuctoo and give some perspectives on what it says about African American history that we don't learn in school. So our family lived here from 1829 until approximately the 1930s. Our ancestor purchased the land, as I said previously, and the land was passed through successive generations just by passing along a deed. So in those days, for example, John Brewer died in 1842. He left the property to his wife, Ann Brewer, his daughter, Sarah, and her husband, Lambert Giles. So they took his will in 1845 and went to William Hilliard and got a mortgage for $155. His will and his deed without getting a new deed. And then in 1875, Lambert Giles died. His son, Joseph Giles, my great-great-grandfather, just took the deed and put it in his pocket. He was living there, so I guess by adverse possession perhaps, the property is now his. In 1930, he was old and feeble. He took that deed to a lawyer in Mount Holly and had a plain warranty deed drawn up conveying the property to his daughter. Then in 1970, his daughter died, and her daughter took ownership of the property and continued to pay the taxes. And in 1989, she decided she would give the property to my mother. So we went and had a deed drawn up, but they said, wait a minute, you have to get title insurance. This property doesn't belong to you, Lillian Giles, in 1989. Didn't belong to your mother in 1970. Didn't belong to her father in 1930. Didn't even belong to her father in 1875. It belonged to him and his 6 siblings. So you have to do a quiet title action to eliminate the interest of all the other heirs, one of whom was the family of my cousin Tracy and Carla. And we went through that process, but the interesting thing about it was, to me, that over all of those years, nobody questioned the transfer of ownership. So we know that's not something that we would do today in the year 2014, but that is how we conducted business in the past. So I wanted to go back to the story of how my cousin Lillian gave this property to us in 1989. My mother and I went to her house. She said she wanted to give us the property. My mother might have known more about this than I did, but she just took an envelope. Out comes the original 1829 deed on parchment paper. I have copies of it here, actually, and I wanted to circulate them to see what people, so people can appreciate what I had access to. You can just pass it around to see. Those were original documents from 1829 and 1831, because we bought one parcel in 1829 for $30, another one for $8.50 in 1831. The original 1842 will, tax receipts, mortgage receipts over that period, and all of these are original documents. And so the thing I like about the original documents is that I'm able to take information from those documents and learn a lot about my family. What could I do with those documents? I could establish a chain of title to show that John Brewer really is connected to Mary Weston, even though there's 150 years apart between the ownership of those respective parties. I could paint a portrait of who my ancestors were and what they did, because there's information, for example, for 1875 and 1876, a mortgage was paid with a wagon load of bricks at $2 per thousand. So that meant, I originally thought that my great-great-great-uncle drove up to William Hilliard's house with a wagon load of bricks. I later learned that William Hilliard owned a brickyard, so probably my family members worked until they produced that many bricks, and that allowed them to pay the mortgage. But the mortgage was paid between 1845. The last payment wasn't made until 1896, I think. So obviously there were many, many missed years there. But basically, I also have the mortgage receipts. I guess I didn't bring them here. On the back of the indenture of mortgage, they were just right. Received of John Giles $3 for the 1846 payment. Received of Ann Brewer $4 for the 55 payment. And we have those records as well. And so again, you get a picture of what your ancestors did and where they lived, because you have almost a narrative of different things about them. So in 1992, we built the house there. I lived in it initially. One day I was digging in the yard with my grandmother, who liked to dig, and I found this. A moonshine jug. My mother doesn't like the story.
That's right. I don't like it.
But in consulting the neighbors and my grandmother, I learned that my Aunt Rosie and her neighbor Henrietta Mitchell had a still. So I don't doubt that this jug once held the whiskey that Aunt Rosie and Henrietta Mitchell made. So I have another picture in my mind now of things that my family did. My mother doesn't want us to be known as moonshiners, right? But I still have a picture that I can use. When I lived at the house, would just gaze into the sky, into the landscape, and think about people that came before me. I could touch a tree that was touched by an ancestor of mine that lived many years ago. Joe Rogers showed me the area where my family's house was that fell down probably in the 1930s. That was the area where we were digging, obviously, to plant a tree. We didn't know we were going to find a jug. I also found one other thing. I actually found quite a few things over time, but the nicest thing I found was this lamp. So again, I have pictures in my mind of my family that people don't typically have. What else was I able to do with this information? Obviously, this was in the early 90s, so we didn't have Ancestry.com and we didn't have searchable databases, but by searching records on microfilm, I was able to find out that my fourth great-grandmother, Anne, who was married to John Brewer, who purchased the property, was born in Pennsylvania in around 1792. By reading her great-grandson's obituary in 1938, I was able to learn that her family were founders of Mother Bethel AME Church in Philadelphia. Mother Bethel has substantial records of their original members. So eventually I can go there and maybe even find who Anne's parents were and go back before the 1790s, earlier into the 18th century. Another thing that's interesting about Burlington County is the records that are available to us, even about African Americans. You can go to the Burlington County Library and search the obituary of the New Jersey Mirror and put in your family name. What did I find there? I found where records going back as far as 1850. I found an obituary of my third great-grandfather, whose name was Lambert Giles, and I would like to read that to you because it gives me insight again into what it was like for black people who lived in this area in that time. It says, this is an obituary from 1875. It says, Lambert Giles, a well-known colored man, long a resident of this vicinity, was found dead by the side of the road from Mount Collie to Rancocas, near the barn of the late Caleb A. Woodward, on Monday evening about 7:30. He had been at work in his usual occupation, whitewashing, in Mount Holly during the day, and left here for his home at Timbuctoo at 7 o'clock. Deceased was subject to attacks of an epileptic nature and doubtless died in a fit of this kind. Coroner Lawmaster viewed the body in company with Dr. Brown, and no doubt being entertained of the cause of his death, an inquest was deemed unnecessary. This is the important part that was very surprising to me. Lambert was an industrious and worthy man, and noted for his courtesy of manner. He was about 60 years of age. And then in a separate news report it said, the sudden demise of the old colored whitewasher Lambert Giles last week put a number of housekeepers on the wing to find someone to fill his engagements. Lambert followed a very humble calling, but was regarded as about perfect in his art and will be more missed than would many of our more pretentious citizens. He was often engaged weeks in advance. Now, what is surprising about that for an 1875 obituary about a black person? First of all, I don't know anybody who's black who can read their ancestors' obituaries in the mainstream paper. This is the Burlington County Times of that day. Secondly, he was not a physician. He was not an attorney. He was not a person of great education, obviously. But he was held in high enough esteem to get an obituary in the local paper, which is such a contrast to me of what we read about the records of African Americans when we do research in genealogy. It turns out that I was able to find in the New Jersey Index, Birth and Christening Index, the births of all of the brothers and sisters of my great-great-grandfather beginning in 1845. Who's able to find that in their newspaper? I also was able to find death records in the New Jersey Death and Burials Index, and these are searchable databases that anybody could really access. But my point is that this gives a very different perspective on African American history. I contrast some of my colleagues, including the historians who are here, who always talk about the horrors of slavery, which we should not ignore. On the other hand, here we have black people buying land in the 1820s. We have black people whose records, whose lives are important enough to document in vital statistics in the 1840s through past slavery. We have stories about the contributions of black people to society that really gave me a very nice picture of where I come from and who my people were. And so I always like to talk about an analogy that I talk about the cup being half full and the cup being half empty. Everybody always talks about how half empty the cup is, but I think my cup was actually half full, and I would like to focus more on the half full than the half empty. I want to close with a couple of things. One, Paul covered a lot of this, but the fact that we had gradual manumission of slavery by law beginning in 1804 means there were a lot of free black people running around New Jersey during that period. And in fact, by 1820, the number of free blacks, which was 12,460, outnumbered those in bondage, which was 7,557 for the first time in 1820. If you look at the entire country in 1840, the population was 17 million, 2.8%, or 2.8 million, or 16.1% were African American, and 386,000 of them were free people. Do you ever get a sense of reading African American history that there were almost 400,000 free black people in the United States in the 1840s? So that is a part of our history that we need to understand more about. And one of the things that I would do if I didn't have to work to eat was to dedicate my time to finding out more about this aspect of African American history that is not well documented, in my view. In closing,